Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're going to step right into the role of a cultural detective. Have you ever felt like the rules of society just completely shifted overnight? Or maybe that the public debates we're constantly having don't entirely make sense? Well, today, we're going to unpack a really provocative and structured explanatory model of modern Western society. It's based entirely on a source text titled A Culture of Delusion. The author presents this fascinating framework for understanding the profound tensions simmering right under the surface of our everyday lives, and we're going to explore exactly how they build that case. Let's dive in.
To set the stage here, consider this striking thought from G.K. Chesterton. He said, "The most dangerous ideas in a society are not the ones being argued, but the ones being assumed." The source text really leans into this, claiming that the most profound transformations in the West haven't happened in our architecture, our demographics, or even our wild leaps in technology. Instead, the real shift has happened totally invisibly. It's taken place entirely in the mind. The author argues it's a fundamental shift in our baseline assumptions about what's good, what's normal, and ultimately, what questions we're even allowed to ask in polite society without facing massive backlash.
And the timeline for this mental shift? According to the author, it spans roughly 50 years. So this wasn't some overnight accident or a sudden violent revolution. Rather, the text argues it's the result of a steady, subtle cultivation by the very institutions that build our society from the ground up. Think our education systems, the media landscape, politics, art, and even the church. The source suggests that generation after generation has slowly just absorbed a new dominant worldview. And it hasn't happened because everyday people are sitting around reading dense philosophical textbooks. It's simply because we are all breathing the cultural air around us, internalizing these new norms little by little.
So how on earth do we actually measure a shift that's largely invisible? Normally, society relies on that traditional political divide of left versus right, but the text proposes a completely different way to look at it. To truly understand modern society, the author argues we need to look past traditional politics entirely and focus instead on an ideological spectrum. This spectrum measures how deeply someone has internalized this new dominant worldview versus how much they resist it based on, say, common sense, religious faith, or their own lived experience. The text notes that while the political left tends to have internalized these assumptions more deeply, literally no one across the political spectrum, not even self-described conservatives, is entirely immune to this cultural error.
Okay, moving to Section 1, the symptoms, baffling cultural phenomena.
The author kicks things off by pointing out what they see as absolute, glaring double standards in how society reacts to public disruption. On one hand, we see climate protests, like those by Extinction Rebellion, actively blocking major highways and damaging property. The text observes that these actions often receive a surprising level of sympathy and leniency from both the media and the courts. But then, on the other hand, protests against immigration policy are frequently met with swift, forceful removal and intense public condemnation. So why the difference? Well, the source argues this stark contrast demonstrates that actions are simply no longer judged objectively by the severity of the disruption, but purely by the ideological color of the cause.
Now, let's talk about education and our concept of authority. The source shares this incredibly striking statistic from the Netherlands, showing that 6 in 10 students leave primary school functionally illiterate. 6 in 10. The text contrasts this demonstrable decline in educational quality with society's sudden newfound deference for youth activists. We're living in a culture where teenagers skipping school to dictate world politics is often highly praised and amplified on a global scale. The author presents this contrast as a major symptom of a culture that has basically started treating traditional adulthood, life experience, and formal education as a burden rather than an achievement that deserves respect.
This framework maps out the author's view of the collapse of traditional social structures against the rise of new ideological norms. Look at these domains. In relationships, the text notes a societal shift from a traditional view centered on commitment and marriage to a new ideology that heavily promotes casual, decoupled sex. Over in religion, the communal structure of the traditional church is being rapidly replaced by the individual, esoteric spiritual experience. And when it comes to authority, a baseline respect for figures like teachers and police officers is being swapped out for a heavy emphasis on horizontal dialogue and empathy. The author uses this map to argue just how comprehensive this shift really is across all layers of human connection.
Let's drill down into that first domain for a second, relationships, which the text cleverly refers to as the disrupted marketplace. The author claims that decoupling sex from love and commitment hasn't just liberated people, it's actually led to severe, often ignored consequences. The text points to stubbornly high divorce rates hovering right around 50% and rising rates of sexually transmitted infections that just go largely ignored in serious public debate.
Beyond health and marriage, the source claims this ideological shift creates a highly skewed relational market. A really small fraction of men receive disproportionate attention, while a significant number of people are just shut out entirely. And the author observes that simply questioning the healthiness of this new normal quickly gets you branded as outdated or overly moralistic.
We see a very similar disruption in the domain of religion. The source contrasts the emptying of traditional churches and what it calls the media's general silence on persecuted Christians globally with the sudden massive boom of what it dubs the spiritual supermarket. As the traditional, geographically bound community vanishes, the text observes this huge rise in things like atheist yoga, healing crystals, and esoteric shops. The paradox here, according to the author, is that people are still desperately seeking spiritual experiences and meaning, but they're doing so entirely as individual consumers, completely without the shared rituals, mutual obligations, and community care that traditional institutions used to demand and provide.
And speaking of seeking experiences, the author observes a literal normalized high in society. The text points out the rapid normalization of vaping, marijuana, and designer drugs, which has occurred right alongside the very real rise of narco-state economies and youth drug careers. What's fascinating about the author's observation here is the nature of the public debate surrounding all of this. The source argues that society focuses almost exclusively on the narrative of personal freedom and individual autonomy, effectively turning a totally blind eye to the massive societal damage, skyrocketing addiction rates, and violent criminal networks that ultimately foot the bill for that freedom. Another very specific symptom the text identifies is labeled the disqualified man. Statistically speaking, the author points out that boys and men are vastly overrepresented in school dropouts, suicide rates, and homelessness. Yet the source perceives a severe imbalance in how gender issues are debated in the public square. There's this constant, highly visible focus on dismantling toxic masculinity, but a near-total lack of policy concern or public empathy for struggling men. Furthermore, the text claims that any regrets expressed by women regarding the outcomes of feminist liberation are completely sidelined from the dominant narrative, simply because they complicate the accepted worldview. Which brings us to an ideological framing outlined really heavily in the source: the glorification of the oppressed. The text observes that the dominant cultural narrative systematically frames minorities, migrants, and indigenous peoples as inherently noble and perpetually victimized by Western structures. According to the author, this specific ideological framing makes it incredibly difficult, if not entirely impossible, to objectively discuss certain realities, things like actual crime statistics or the practical, logistical impacts of mass migration. Why? Because the ideology has already predetermined the conclusion, who the victim is and who the oppressor is, long before any actual facts are even examined.
All right, on to Section 2, the diagnosis, a collective state of mind.
The author grounds their ultimate diagnosis of society right in the field of psychiatry. Clinically speaking, a delusion is defined as a psychiatric condition where a person holds beliefs that are demonstrably at odds with reality, and crucially, those beliefs cannot be revised by evidence, logic, or argument. The text makes it very, very clear that understanding this definition is essential. A delusion is not a lie. The person genuinely believes what they are saying. Furthermore, it has absolutely nothing to do with intelligence. Highly educated, brilliant people can be profoundly deluded. The defining feature the author stresses is a fierce, almost impenetrable resistance to correction.
The core thesis of the source text is that this clinical concept of a delusion has scaled up to encompass our entire culture. We are looking at a society actively trying to resolve its cognitive dissonance by reinterpreting facts rather than going through the incredibly painful process of reconsidering its deeply held beliefs. When reality violently clashes with the dominant narrative, whether that takes the form of failing schools, rising crime, or broken relationships, society instinctively bends and twists the facts to protect the worldview. The author argues that this exact dynamic, sacrificing objective reality just to preserve an ideological narrative, is the absolute hallmark of a collective delusion.
And here is the author's grand conclusion, tying all of those baffling symptoms together. That collective delusion has a specific name: Romantic-Marxist ideology. The text asserts that this worldview is a potent blend. It combines a romantic obsession with individual feelings, authentic self-expression, and victimhood, with a Marxist view of a world divided purely and cleanly into oppressors and the oppressed. And you don't need to have ever picked up a book by Rousseau or Karl Marx to be under its influence. The author argues it is the invisible force, that cultural air we've been talking about, creating the tension, the double standards, and the shifting baseline of normality that we've mapped out today. So, we finally arrive at the ultimate challenge posed by the source text. If you recognize these phenomena, if you see the double standards in the justice system, the disrupted marketplaces of modern relationships, and the shifting sands of authority in your own life or community, are you ready to ask the right questions? The author argues that once you see the underlying pattern, you begin to see it literally everywhere. I hope this explainer has given you a clear, structured lens to critically examine the assumptions we breathe in every single day. The text leaves us with an incredibly provocative thought. If the ideas we just passively assume are actually more dangerous than the ones we argue about, what assumptions are you making right now? Thanks for exploring this with me. Keep asking questions.